Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. As I'm sitting here writing this, it's late fall of 2019 inches, the southern Appalachians. And part of me still can't believe any of this happened in the same hills where I used to catch salamanders and skip rocks as a kid. Another part of me feels like I've been living with this for so long that it's the only thing I know how to talk about anymore. I've told this story to my family, to my few neighbors scattered up and down our ridge, to guys at the garage where I work, to the sheriff's office, even to some random podcast host who never called me back. And it still doesn't feel like enough. I don't know if I'm trying to warn people or just keep myself from feeling crazy, but I know I can't keep this all in my own head. So here goes. I grew up in a small town tucked into the Appalachian foothills, the kind of place where the mountains are always at the edge of your vision and the sound of coal trucks on the highway is like background noise. My parents worked their way out of a lot of hard years and retired early down in Florida. And when I was in my mid-20s, steady job as a mechanic, steady girlfriend named Rachel, who's now my fiancée, they signed the old family place over to me. It's a red brick house that sits way up at the very end of a narrow, cracked road, the last property before the land tips down into a steep holler and then climbs up again into national forest. Around here, most homes are clapboard or double wides with tin roofs. That brick makes our place stand out from the trees, like somebody dropped a city house on the mountainside. I kinda like that about it. The house is old, older than I can really wrap my head around. My granddad laid his hands on it, and then my dad. And they each added little makeshift renovations, an enclosed porch here, a crooked set of steps there, but the bones are ancient brick and old timber that creaks when the temperature drops. There are only a few houses along our road, and by the time you get to ours, you're basically alone. Behind us, the land falls off into a tangle of oak and poplar and mountain laurel. Miles of government land with old logging roads and forgotten coal cuts and streams that disappear into the ground. As a kid, my brother and I would disappear in those woods all day, scrambling up game trails and crawling through rhododendron tunnels, swearing we'd make it to the next ridge and never quite getting there. The forest felt like a big, wild playground to me, not something to be afraid of, and that never really changed. I've always liked being a little out of the way. Liked the feeling that once I turn off the highway and wind up our road, the rest of the world can't quite find me. When Rachel and I moved in together, it felt like the start of a calm, ordinary life. Small town garage for me, hospital job for her, a hand-me-down house we didn't have to pay a mortgage on. If I'm honest, I thought my life had already settled into what it was going to be. And then the snow came. It started the first winter we were there. I can't tell you the exact date anymore, just that there'd been a good, clean snowfall overnight, the kind that makes the whole holler quiet and bright. And it was a Sunday morning, the only day I let myself sleep past 6. I remember that comforting heaviness of the blankets, the way the light looked in the bedroom, and how Rachel was still breathing slow beside me as I pulled on my jeans and boots. My ritual on Sundays has always been simple. Drive down the mountain, grab coffee from the gas station, sit in the truck for a few minutes and just breathe before the week starts again. I stepped out onto the front porch, the boards creaking under my weight, and the air hit me sharp, clean, the kind of cold that cuts through your sleepiness in one breath. The driveway was a smooth white sheet around my old F-150. The truck sitting there like a toy someone had forgotten to move before shaking flour over the whole scene. I walked down the steps, and that's when I saw it. A single trail of footprints pressed into the snow, coming in from the direction of the tree line. At first, my mind did what everybody's mind does when reality and comfort collide. It reached for the least threatening explanation. I figured maybe Rachel had gotten up before me without my noticing and gone out to check something in the car. But as I followed the line of prints with my eyes, that idea broke apart. The trail didn't start at the house. It came from the woods, up over the little rise at the edge of the yard, across the open snow, straight to the driver's side of my truck. Stopped there for a few beats, enough for somebody to stand and look in, and then turned around and went right back the way it came. No detours toward the windows, no circling the house, no path to the front door. Just a clean, purposeful walk from the forest to my truck and back into the trees. I stood there for a long minute, coffee run completely forgotten, looking at those prints and feeling this strange combination of exposure and unreality, like the forest had leaned in closer than it ever had before. The details of that morning have gone a little blurry with time, but I remember asking Rachel later if she'd gone out while I was asleep, and the confused look she gave me. I remember forcing a laugh, saying it was probably just some neighbor cutting through, even though nobody would need to cut through our place to get anywhere. I brushed it aside because it was easier that way. I wish Id paid more attention. It was at least a couple of winters later when things escalated. The year the Panthers blew it in the Super Bowl and people around here were cussing at TVs in every bar and living room. I remember that because Id stayed up late watching the game and slept worse than usual, replaying dropped passes in my head. The next morning was a weekday, I think, because I remember already being behind schedule for the shop. It had snowed overnight again. Not as deep as that first time, but enough to give everything a fresh coat. I yanked on my boots, grabbed my keys, and stepped out the front door and instantly knew something was wrong. The yard wasn't smooth anymore. It was torn up. There were footprints everywhere. They ran along the driveway, around the back of the house, under the bedroom window, even along the narrow strip of ground between the porch and the foundation. The snow around the brick walls looked like somebody had paced there for hours, just circling and circling while we slept. My heart started thudding, but I went into this strange, automatic mode. I told myself not to panic, that freaking out wouldn't help Rachel, and hurried around the house scanning for movement. No broken windows, no doors ajar, no fresh smoke in the distance that might mean a nearby camp, just those tracks, closing in on the house from the woods and bleeding out again into the trees. I wanted to follow them right then, but the clock in my head was screaming that I was late, and I didn't want to spook Rachel before I had time to really look around. I texted her as I backed down the driveway, told her there were some weird tracks in the snow, to lock the doors and call me if she heard anything. I spent the whole morning at work going through the motions and not really being present, checking my phone every 5 minutes, waiting for something bad to show up on the screen. By midday, I told my boss I wasn't feeling right and drove home early. When I pulled into the driveway, Rachel was already outside, bundled up in a big jacket, standing near the side of the house with this tight, pale look on her face. She walked me over to one particular trail and pointed down, her voice all tight as she said she couldn't stop staring at them. The prints were clearer now than they'd been in my rushed scan that morning. The sun had shifted, and the shadows defined them. It took me a second, and then I saw what she meant. There were no tread patterns, no marks from boots or sneakers, just the shape of a foot. Heel, arch, toes, bare skin on snow. Something in my chest dropped straight through me. The idea of someone walking around our house while we slept was bad enough. The idea of them doing it barefoot in Appalachian winter, cold. There's something fundamentally wrong about that. Something that makes your mind try to recoil. While we were walking the perimeter, I noticed something I still haven't told my parents about. Under our bedroom window, where our bed sits up against the wall inside, there was a smear on the glass at face height. The frost from the night had melted there in the rough shape of a long, spread handprint, like someone had stood close and rested their palm on the pane while they tried to look in. You could see where the fingers had slid upward a little before pulling away. I cleaned it off before Rachel noticed. Told myself she didn't need that image in her head, but that print lives in mine. We called my dad, thinking maybe there was some reasonable explanation, some old story about teenagers drinking in the woods back in his day. Anything that would make this feel like a stupid prank, instead of what it felt like a violation. He said He'd never seen anything like that in all the years He'd lived there, that if it were him, He'd get his rifle and see how far those tracks went. Rachel wanted to call the sheriff right away, but I kept thinking they'd ask what crime had been committed, and I wouldn't have a clean answer beyond trespassing. I told her we'd call if I found anything more substantial. I loaded my .30-06, shrugged into my coat, and headed into the woods with the kind of false bravado you put on like a uniform. The tree line behind our house drops off quick into a hollow, then climbs back up through thick laurel and undergrowth, so you end up following the path of least resistance. Game trails, old ATV ruts, faint traces of logging roads that haven't seen a truck in decades. The bare footprints were easy to follow at first, clear impressions leading down into the hollow. For about half an hour, I tracked them, my breath ghosting in the cold air, the sound of the road and the town fading away until it was just me and the crunch of old snow and distant crows. That forest I'd always loved felt different that afternoon, like it was watching me back. Then, out of nowhere, the trail split. One line of footprints veered off to the left, angling up toward a ridge. Another kept going straight ahead. There weren't any extra tracks leading up to the split, no sign of someone stepping aside and then returning. Just one set of bare feet becoming two. For a minute I stood there, turning in a slow circle, feeling that sense of being played with. Maybe the person had doubled back and started walking in their own footprints to confuse anyone who followed. Maybe there were two of them from the start, one stepping perfectly inside the other's tracks until they decided to separate. Neither thought made me feel any better. I picked the left trail at random and followed it for another stretch until it did something that made even less sense. It just stopped. No tree to climb, no rock outcropping, no frozen stream to step onto. One last clear print and then nothing. Just unbroken snow and the bare, winter-dull forest in every direction. I told myself maybe the snow texture had changed. Maybe the prints were just harder to see, and forced myself to circle outward, looking for the trail to pick up again. But it never did. I followed the straight-ahead path for a while after backtracking, but my stomach was in knots, and the light between the trees was changing. Before I turned around for good, I came across something that still sits ugly in my mind. In a little dip between two hills, just off the prints, there was a deer laid out in the snow, not like hunters leave them. Its hide was still on, but the belly had been opened and cleaned in this rough, messy way, like somebody who half knew what they were doing had tried to butcher it on the ground. The front legs had been crossed over its chest. The same bare footprints had been following circled around it, close in, pressed deep into the trampled snow. I checked for a tag or bullet wound, anything that would make it feel like some weird poacher's job, but there was nothing I could understand there. Just meat and silence and the metallic smell of blood frozen into the air. That was enough for me. I went home, called the sheriff like he'd promised, and tried to explain to the deputy on the phone why it felt like more than somebody messing around in the snow. They listened, took a report, and told us they'd send a car up to drive by a few nights, but there wasn't much they could do without a face, a name, or a broken lock. That night, it snowed hard. By morning, every print was gone. The next few winters passed quiet. We got engaged on the back porch one warm autumn evening, watching the sun drop behind the ridge, and we focused on all the things people focus on when they're trying to build a life. Saving money, picking dates, arguing over paint colors and wedding playlists. The house settled around us again. The forest went back to being a backdrop. If you'd asked me then, I would have said that whatever that was, it was over. I'd still wake up some nights thinking I heard something under the bedroom window, but there'd be nothing there. And after a while, the brain files things away under weird but harmless. I wouldn't be writing any of this if it had stayed that way. This past January, after the holidays, after we'd both gone back to our routines, I woke up to Rachel sitting on the edge of the bed, already dressed, staring out the window with this hollow look on her face. I sat up and followed her gaze and felt my stomach lock up. The first thing I saw was the yard, tracked up, again a whole map of prints. The second thing was the shed. The door, which I always bolt, was standing open a few inches, the padlock hanging twisted on the hasp. I threw on clothes and went outside before she could say anything. The cold hit me like a wall, but the adrenaline was stronger. There were footprints everywhere, just like before, looping the house, walking up to each window, trailing off toward the tree line. They were bare again. That much I could tell at a glance now, toes and heels and nothing in between. I walked down to the shed, my boots crunching over the maze of tracks, and pushed the door open the rest of the way. The inside was a mess. A couple of my better tools were gone. A chainsaw, a heavy-duty pry bar, the old hatchet I kept by the door. But it wasn't just theft. On the inside of the shed door, gouged into the wood with something sharp, someone had carved a rough outline of a house with 4 little square windows and a triangle roof. Next to it were 27 short, vertical scratch marks, all lined up in careful rows like tally marks in some private language. There was also a photograph tacked to the back wall with a rusted nail. An old Polaroid, edges curled, showing our brick house from behind the tree line at night. No porch light, no visible cars, just the faint glow from what I knew had to be our bedroom window. Neither Rachel nor I had ever taken that picture. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I called my friend Caleb that afternoon. Caleb's one of those guys who grew up hunting these mountains and then went off to the military and came back with better gear and worse sleep. As a careful man, not prone to exaggeration or ghost stories, which is why I trusted him with the whole thing. Bare footprints, the deer, the carved door, the photo, all of it. He listened, didn't say much, and then told me he'd be up that evening, that he had a thermal scope on his AR that would let us see what we were dealing with if it came to that. Rachel was torn between wanting us to stay inside and wanting these people found. I promised her we'd be careful, that we'd turn back before dark, that we weren't going out there looking for a fight, just answers. By the time Caleb's truck bounced up our rutted driveway, the day was already thinning, winter light draining fast. We layered up, checked our guns, his AR with the expensive glass, my old deer rifle with a basic scope, and walked to where the prints spilled out of the yard and into the woods. I remember the smell of wood smoke from some distant neighbor's stove, the crunch of snow under Caleb's boots, and the way my heart felt too big in my chest. At first, we talked in low voices, the way guys do when they're trying to keep things light. But after a while, the conversation died on its own, out there. With the mountains folding in around you and bare trees like black ribs against the sky, words start to feel small and breakable. The footprints led us down into the hollow and up the other side, farther than he'd gone alone that first time. Every now and then they'd do that same trick, splitting, then dead-ending, forcing us to backtrack and pick up the main line. Caleb muttered that whoever was doing this knew what they were doing, that walking backward like that without muddling the snow wasn't something your average drunk trespasser pulled off by accident. I kept thinking about those tally marks on the shed door, wondering if they were days, or nights, or something else. As we got deeper into the forest, we came across another scene that turned my stomach. In a little clearing tucked behind a stand of hemlocks, there was a crude sort of camp, a low ring of stones blackened by old fires, a pile of stripped branches stacked carefully and hanging from one of the lower branches of a tree, a length of orange extension cord tied into a noose. Below it, half buried in the snow, was my missing pry bar. Around the fire ring were bare footprints pressed deep, as if people had stood there for long stretches just shifting their weight in the cold. No sleeping bags, no tent, nothing that looked like shelter. Just the suggestion of people who knew how to disappear quickly. The sun slid behind the ridge while we were still winding our way through thickets, the world fading to that blue-gray that makes depth hard to judge. The footprints, if anything, got deeper, as if whoever we were following had started to tire and sink more with each step. Caleb flicked his thermal on every few minutes, sweeping the trees, then shaking his head. We both knew we'd gone farther than we'd planned, but turning back without something, anything, felt unbearable. The moment everything shifted is sharp in my memory. All the surrounding hours blurred around it. We were moving in single file along a faint old logging road, footprints guiding us like a dotted line, when Caleb suddenly pressed his forearm across my chest to stop me. He didn't say a word, just lowered himself into a crouch behind the nearest tree, his whole body going still in a way I'd only seen in people who'd been trained to be still like that. I dropped beside him, breath loud in my own ears, and watched him bring the rifle to his shoulder, I kissing the thermal scope. His hand, usually rock steady, had the slightest tremor. 20 seconds, maybe more, passed like that. I couldn't take it. He eased the rifle down, his jaw clenched, and handed it to me without a word. I brought the scope up, pressed my eye to it, and the world went black and white and alive with heat. Ahead of us, maybe 100 yards out in a small, scooped-out depression between the trees. There were 4 shapes. At first I thought they were black bears hunched over a carcass, the way they were clustered together. But bears don't have shoulders like that, or calves, or elbows. 2 of the figures were big, wide through the chest, their spines curved like they were trying to make themselves small against the cold. The other 2 were smaller, clinging to a slim tree just off to the side, arms and legs wrapped around the trunk. They kept jerking their heads around in these quick, twitchy movements like feral cats. All 4 of them were pale on the scope, heat blooming off bare skin. No coats, no hats, no boots, naked in the snow. They were eating something. I couldn't make out what, just that their hands kept moving to their mouths, heads ducking and rising in this animal rhythm. One of the larger ones reached up at one point and wiped its face with the back of its arm, and I saw the hot streaks smear across its skin in the scope's white glow. My whole body wanted to reject what I was seeing. The mountains are full of stories, people gone off the grid, old families in hollers, nobody visits, conspiracy stuff about cults and meth cooks and worse, but none of that prepares you for the sight of 4 human beings, naked and silent in the dead of winter, pressed into the snow like they belonged to it more than you did. After a while, seconds, minutes, I don't know, the 2 big ones moved toward the smaller 2. Each lifted one of the smaller figures up, settling them on their shoulders like parents carrying tired kids from a car, and the 4 of them turned and drifted deeper into the trees, heat signatures shrinking on the scope until they were gone. Caleb and I didn't speak. We stayed crouched behind that tree for what felt like an hour. Every sound amplified. The distant creak of frozen branches, our own breathing, a far-off train horn echoing along the valley like it belonged to another planet. When we finally moved, it was slow, careful, each step placed like we were afraid the ground would shout. The hike back felt twice as long, the dark swallowing the path so that without Caleb's thermal we would have been blind. By the time the warm square of our kitchen window came into view through the trees, my legs were numb and my mind was buzzing like a kicked beehive. Rachel was still awake, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee gone cold in front of her. She didn't ask much. I didn't tell much. Just enough to make it clear that this wasn't teenagers, wasn't a prank, wasn't anything simple. We called the sheriff that night. To their credit, they took it more seriously this time. A couple of deputies and a state guy showed up at first light, and Caleb and I led them as far as we could retrace our steps. But the temperature had climbed a little overnight, and a thin, misty rain had fallen just enough to blur everything. The prints were half melted. The clearing wedge seen from the scope looked like any other patch of ground. The camp with the extension cord noose was nothing but wet stones and a few charred scraps of wood. The officers did a grid search for a few hours, radios crackling, boots slogging through slush. In the end, they told us what I already knew they would. Without bodies, without solid tracks, without evidence of a specific crime besides trespassing and some missing tools, there wasn't much justification for a full-scale search party. They promised to have patrols swing by more often, told us to call if we heard or saw anything new, wrote things down in notebooks that probably got closed on a desk somewhere that afternoon. Caleb and I knew what we'd seen. The image lives behind my eyelids now. Winter's settling in again as I write this. The air has that edge to it that means the first real snow isn't far off. Rachel and I talk about moving in this hesitant, guilty way. Like we'd be abandoning my grandparents' work, my parents' memories, like we'd be letting whoever those people are push us off land. That's been in my family longer than I've been alive. At the same time, every time I wake up to branches scraping the side of the house or the distant crack of ice in the woods, my heart jumps straight to my throat, and I lie there listening for footsteps under the window. None of our neighbors up and down the ridge have reported anything like this. Nobody's missing tools. Nobody's seen bare footprints. Nobody's found handprints on their glass or strange marks carved into their sheds. Sometimes I tell myself that means we're just unlucky, that the house at the edge of the holler was the first place these people found and they kept coming back out of habit. Other times I wonder if there's something about our spot, our isolation, our blind corners that makes it perfect for whoever lives out there in those ridges just past where most people bother to walk. I'm not telling this story because I want attention or because I think it's some kind of campfire tale. I'm telling it because it's been happening in one way or another for years now, and I still don't know what to do beyond buying heavier locks and keeping the rifle closer to the bed. Maybe you've seen something like this in your own corner of the Appalachians, or maybe you've spent enough time in these mountains to have a theory about who chooses to live out there with no clothes and no heat, walking barefoot through snow while the rest of us pretend we're alone. If any of this sounds even a little familiar, or if you think you know what we ran into in those woods, I genuinely want to hear it. Leave a comment, share your own story, or just tell me what you do in my boots. Because some nights it feels like the only thing standing between us and whatever lives at the edge of our yard is the fact that I haven't stopped talking about it. Story 2. Last summer, I decided to give myself a kind of gift and a kind of test. A long solo backpacking trip along a remote stretch of the Appalachian backcountry. The kind of route where the Appalachian Trail runs nearby, but the side trails and old forest roads peel you off into places most day hikers never see. I live a few hours from the mountains, and I've always loved losing myself up there for a weekend, but this was different. My plan was simple on paper: leave my car at a small trailhead lot near a forgotten West Virginia hollow, pay a local shuttle driver to drop me off more than a week's walk away on the other side of the ridge system, and then spend 10 or 11 days winding my way back through the national forest, following a mix of marked trail and old, barely used logging cuts. I'd done my homework, I was in good shape, and being alone in the woods had always felt more calming than threatening to me. That's the part that hits me the hardest now, remembering how safe I used to feel out there, how easy it was to believe the scariest things in the Appalachians were black bears and thunderstorms. The first few days went exactly how I'd hoped they would. The trail climbed and dropped with the rhythm of the land, along knife-edge ridgelines where you could see blue layers of mountains fading off forever, then down into cool, damp hollows where rhododendron formed green tunnels and small creeks whispered over rocks slick with moss. I moved well, steady and controlled, stopping every hour or so just to listen. At night, I'd leave the main trail and push a few hundred yards into the woods, just far enough that no one passing by would see the glow of my headlamp. It's a habit I picked up years ago. If you're alone, it feels better to be invisible. I'd pitch my little tent, cook something simple, hang my food, and fall asleep to the sound of wind moving in the canopy. Up until the third night, the trip felt like exactly what I needed. Looking back, that's the last night I remember feeling completely at ease. I woke up sometime after midnight with that heavy, instinctive jolt you get when your mind knows something is off before you can label it. The forest was quiet in that particular way that makes your skin feel too tight. No owl calls, no insect drone, just the faint ticking of branches shifting. I lay there for a minute in the dark, listening to my own breathing, telling myself it was nothing, but my gut wouldn't let it go. I unzipped the sleeping bag, reached for the rifle. I always bring on longer trips in remote areas, not because I want to use it, but because not having it would feel irresponsible, and slid my hand along the tent floor until I found my flashlight. When I eased the zipper open and stepped out into the night, the air was cool and still, the stars dimmed by the thickness of the trees. The forest floor washed in the narrow cone of my beam. Nothing moved. No eye shine between trunks. No rustle of something big slipping away. I walked the perimeter of my little camp, heart rate slowly easing back down, and then crawled back inside, feeling slightly ridiculous. It wasn't until morning, when I reached for my pack to grab my wallet and tuck a few bills into my pocket before the day's hike, that I realized something was actually wrong. The pocket where I always keep my wallet was open. The zipper tugged all the way back. At first I thought maybe I'd left it unzipped, that I'd been careless. But the bottom of the pocket was empty. I checked every other pouch, turned the pack upside down, shook it out onto the tent floor. Nothing. No wallet, no cards, no cash, no ID. For a few minutes I tried to convince myself I'd left it back in my car by mistake. But I'm not sloppy with that kind of thing. It had been there, and now it wasn't. The idea that someone could unzip my pack inches from where I was sleeping and take one thing without waking me up worked on me from the inside, like a slow acid. There was no cell service on that ridge. No way to cancel cards or call for help. In the end, I did the only thing that made sense, told myself. It'd probably dropped it at the last campsite somehow, even though I knew I hadn't. Shouldered my gear and started hiking. The woods were still beautiful that day, but something in me had shifted. Every time the trail curved and I couldn't see more than a few yards ahead, I imagined someone stepping just out of sight. Every time I heard a branch snap or a stone roll, my hand moved a little closer to the rifle sling. I told myself that if somebody had wanted to hurt me, they'd had a perfect opportunity right next to my tent and hadn't taken it. That thought was not as comforting as I wanted it to be. Over the next couple of days, things went from unsettling to undeniably wrong. It started small. One of my lighters gone from the side pocket of my pack, then the cheap little folding knife I used to cut paracord, then a couple of energy bars I knew I hadn't eaten yet. I kept going back and forth in my head. Am I really losing this much stuff, or is someone taking it? But the pattern was too tight to be chance. I'd go to sleep with everything arranged one way under the vestibule of my tent and wake up finding little differences, small shifts that made my skin crawl. A boot nudged half an inch out of line. A stuffed sack rotated like someone had lifted and set it back down. One morning, after a fitful night, I unzipped the tent to find my driver's license propped up against a rock directly in front of the door, perfectly centered, my own face staring back at me through a thin smear of dirt. The wallet was still gone, but someone had kept that one card, carried it with them, and then walked back into my camp while I slept to leave it there like a calling card. There were no tracks I could see, just a few scuffs in the leaf litter. But I felt more exposed than if they'd put hands on me. Whoever it was wanted me to know they'd been there and that they knew exactly who I was. That was the first truly horror movie moment, and it was real. Not supernatural, just a stranger's deliberate cruelty. From then on, I started tying my tent zipper from the inside every night with a piece of cord. A makeshift lock that probably wouldn't stop anyone persistent but made me feel like it'd at least have a warning. Sleep became something I grabbed in fractured chunks instead of slipping into naturally. My thoughts spiraled during the day, replaying every strange detail on a loop. I thought about turning back, but I was deep in the route by then, far enough that reversing course would still mean multiple nights out with nowhere safer to go. There was no quick exit, just miles and slow calculation. At some point in the middle of the trip, after another long, mentally exhausted day, I made camp near a narrow saddle between two peaks, far off the main trail in a stand of hemlocks. I tied the zipper, put the rifle at my side, and tried to convince my brain to shut down. Sometime in the dead hours, I woke to the sound of something dragging slowly across the nylon of the tent, just a faint, deliberate scrape, starting near my feet and moving upward. I froze, every muscle locked, listening. The scraping stopped near my shoulder. For a moment, there was only my heartbeat, loud and mechanical, and then the faint tick of the zipper pull shifting. Whoever was outside was testing it, just enough to make it jingle. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The zipper didn't open. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of footfalls, very soft, retreated through the pine needles around my camp. I stayed awake until the first gray light seeped into the forest, fingers cramped around the rifle. When I finally forced myself to sit up and unknot the cord, I found that the person hadn't needed to get inside to get to me. On the inside floor of the tent, near my head, was a small, smooth stone that hadn't been there when I zipped up. It was cold to the touch and scratched with a crude, crooked, smiley face, like someone had spent time etching it with the point of a knife. I don't remember putting that stone in my pocket, but I must have, because I found it weeks later at home, and I still don't know why I kept it. The next day, my world shrank to the 3 or 4 feet in front of me. I walked hour after hour, my body moving on autopilot, my brain stuck in a loop of worst-case scenarios. Every rustle in the underbrush sounded like a person. Every shadow at the edge of my vision felt like it had weight and intention. And then the hallucinations started. I've never had anxiety problems in my everyday life. I work a normal job, pay my bills, sleep just fine. Out there, though, with too little rest, too much adrenaline, and too few options, my mind started slipping sideways. As I was picking my way down a rocky stretch of trail, I stepped into what felt like an ankle-deep puddle. Cold water soaked my sock, splashing up around my boot, the chill so sharp it made me gasp. I half stumbled, caught myself on a sapling, and then looked down and there was nothing. The ground was bone dry, dusty even, a thin puff of soil still settling around my laces. A ring of dampness had appeared on the sock when I peeled the boot off, like my body had decided to complete the illusion just to mess with me. Later that afternoon, as the trail contoured around a steep slope above a ravine, I heard my own name whispered from somewhere upslope, clear as if someone had leaned into my ear. I spun around so fast I almost lost my balance, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. Even knowing, logically, that stress could do that to a person didn't make it feel less real in the moment. That was its own kind of horror, realizing your brain could generate perfect sensory experiences that weren't true while someone who meant you harm might be out there in the same woods, very real and very patient. At one point, I left the trail for a bathroom break and spotted something through the trees that stopped me cold. A small structure tucked into the hillside, made from fallen branches and a blue tarp so filthy it blended almost perfectly with the forest floor. It wasn't quite a full shack, more of a lean-to, but it had clearly been used. Inside there were piles of old clothing and a crusted sleeping bag, a ring of stones from a tiny cook fire, and scattered bones that looked like they came from small game squirrels or rabbits, gnawed clean. Among the trash on the ground, my eye caught something familiar. The wrapper from the exact brand of energy bar that had gone missing 2 nights earlier, crumpled and tossed aside. A smear of chocolate still visible on the foil. Next to it, nailed into a tree trunk with a rusted nail, was a piece of cloth torn from the sleeve of my base layer, which I hadn't even realized was ripped. It wasn't a cryptic symbol or a cult shrine or anything supernatural. It was worse, because it was so mundanely human. Someone living rough, close enough to shadow trail users, taking what they wanted and leaving little trophies to prove they'd been there. I backed out of that lean-to with my heart thudding, the feeling of being watched so intense it made my skin prickle. I moved faster after that, pushing my pace even when my legs protested. I told myself that if I could just get close enough to the trailhead, I'd power through a full night and hike out without stopping. The days blurred together in a mix of exhaustion and dread. I'd tie the tent, lie down, listen for hours, maybe sleep for 45 minutes, then jerk awake convinced someone was standing just outside. One night, lying on my back with my eyes half closed, I felt a distinct pressure against my shoulder, as if someone had rested a hand there from outside the tent wall, firm, steady, fingers spread. It felt like it lasted for 10 seconds, maybe less. But I didn't move, and when I finally forced myself to sit up, there was nothing. No shadow, no indentation, just the thin fabric and empty air. A rational part of me knew it could have been my own muscles misfiring, my body traveling that last step into full-on panic. But that didn't make it easier to breathe. At some point near the end of the route, after a night where footsteps had circled my campsite slowly for what felt like hours, never too close, never far away, just looping at the edge of my hearing, I decided I was done. My map told me I was roughly a day and a half from my car with normal hiking hours. I decided that normal was over. The next morning, as soon as there was enough light to see the white blazes on the trees, I packed up camp with shaking hands and started moving. I didn't take my usual breaks. I ate on the go. When the sun started to slide behind the ridgeline, I didn't look for a campsite. I pulled out my headlamp, shifted the rifle to a position where I could grab it quickly, and kept walking. I had never night hiked for more than an hour or two before, and I was not prepared for how disorienting it is in steep, rocky terrain. The world shrank to the narrow cone of my light. The rest of the forest pressed in like a solid wall. My depth perception went funny. Every branch reaching across the trail looked like an arm. My feet caught on roots that I would have stepped cleanly over in daylight. The whole time, there was this background sense that the darkness just beyond my light had weight to it, like someone was moving just outside the circle, matching my pace. An hour passed, maybe more. My watch said I was close, no more than a couple of hours if I could hold the pace. I was rehearsing what I'd say to the police, how I'd try to convince them that a weird guy in the woods was enough to warrant a report, when I heard it. Definite, rhythmic footfalls behind me on the same trail, not off in the brush. For a second I thought Id imagined it, but then they came again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned slowly, raised the beam of my headlamp, and swept it down the trail. At first there was nothing. The trees just swallowed the light. Then, just at the edge of where the beam started to weaken, something moved behind a trunk, a slinking, sideways motion, like someone trying to use the tree as cover and failing by a second. I don't know what switched in me at that point, but a kind of cold clarity took over. I brought the rifle up, aimed at the tree, and in a steady voice that didn't sound like mine, told whoever was there to step out where I could see them. A shape detached itself from the trunk, and for a second my brain refused to categorize it as human, not because it looked supernatural, but because it was so far outside what I expected to see in the middle of the night. He was tall but stooped, as if his spine had forgotten what straight felt like. His hair was long and matted around his face, his beard uneven, his skin smeared with dirt and thin enough that I could see ribs under it, and he was wearing nothing but a pair of shorts. I recognized instantly my own. The quick dry shorts I had packed as a spare and hadn't even noticed were missing. He squinted into the light like it physically hurt him, eyes narrow and unfocused, and started walking slowly toward me, bare feet completely unbothered by the rocks and sticks on the trail. There were scratches all over his chest and legs, some fresh, some scars. His expression was not rage or fear or surprise. It was something flatter, more distant, like he was deciding in real time what category to put me in. Predatory, curious. My hand stayed steady on the rifle, mostly because I'd run out of any other options. My voice came out louder the second time, telling him to stop, but he kept coming. One slow step, then another, as if the gun meant nothing. I don't remember making the decision to fire. My finger moved before the rest of my mind caught up. I aimed slightly to his right and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the trees like a bomb, the muzzle flash lighting the trunks for a split second. He flinched hard, stumbling sideways, and then turned and sprinted off the trail into the darkness with a speed I would not have believed his thin body capable of. Branches whipped and snapped in his wake for a few seconds, and then there was only the ringing in my own ears. I stood there for a long time, the rifle still aimed at the emptiness where it had been, waiting for him or someone else to reappear. No one did. When my legs finally started working again, I turned and walked. I didn't run. I couldn't. Every muscle in my body felt like overstretched rubber. By the time I saw the faint glint of metal from the trailhead sign and the shape of my car materializing out of the dark, it was the closest thing to religious relief I have ever felt. I locked the doors as soon as I was inside, sat there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and dialed 911. When the officer eventually arrived, there's no such thing as a quick response in those mountains. He listened to my story, eyes narrowing slightly at certain details, and told me something I still think about, that the woods in Appalachia are full of people most of us will never meet, folks who slip between the cracks, off the grid, into unused hunting cabins and caves and old mining shacks, some of them damaged, some of them dangerous. And that if I was smart, I'd count myself lucky and go home. They took a report. They drove slowly up and down the nearest forest roads with their lights on for a while. Then I was alone again. The part of this I keep returning to in my mind isn't just the man in my shorts or the lean-to in the hillside. It's the way my own brain turned against me out there, how easily exhaustion and fear twisted reality. I'm not saying everything I saw was a hallucination. Those missing items were real. That stone with the carved face was real. That filthy shelter was real. That barefoot man definitely was real. But mixed in with those concrete details were sensory glitches I would have sworn under oath were true if you'd asked me in the moment. That combination, the real and the imagined, is what made the experience feel like I was walking through somebody else's nightmare. It's going to be a long time before I hike alone for more than a night or two again, especially in the more isolated parts of the Appalachians. And when I do, I won't kid myself about what people are capable of when they live outside the thin, polite layer of society most of us float on. I still don't know what that man wanted from me, or how long he shadowed my route, or how many campsites he watched without me ever knowing. I only know he chose not to hurt me when he easily could have. And that might be the most unnerving part of all. If you've ever done long solo hikes in these mountains, or had something strange happen out in the woods you still can't explain, I'd honestly like to hear it. Drop a comment, tell me what you think I ran into or what you would have done differently. Because some nights when I wake up in my perfectly normal bed in my perfectly normal house, I still feel like I'm back on that narrow ridge with the beam of my headlamp shaking and the sound of footsteps just behind me. Story 3. I'm going to do my best to tell this the way it was told to me, but I'll admit up front that some of the edges are probably worn down by time. It's a story my best friend Ethan shared with me more than once. Always late at night, when Head had just enough to drink that the mask slipped and the past came pouring out. And even after all these years, it still creeps into my head when I drive past certain stretches of the Appalachians and see those dark timbered slopes dropping away into nowhere. Ethan's dad, Ray Hollis, made his living in those mountains for decades as a cutter, running a massive tree saw and hardwood jobs high up on ridges where you're closer to the clouds than the nearest town. It was the kind of machine that could grip a huge oak or poplar, shear it off in a second, and buck it into lengths like it was nothing. The way their operation worked, Ray and the other saw operator, a guy named Griffin Marks, got paid by how many trees they could put on the ground, not by the hour. So they drove themselves hard, 16, sometimes 20-hour days, cutting in all kinds of weather, just the two of them, out ahead of the rest of the crew. After Ray and Griffin finished their section, the skidder operators and truck drivers came in to drag the logs to the landing and haul them down to the mill. That meant half the time Ray was working alone on one end of a job while Griffin worked the other, with nothing but their radios and the occasional engine noise for company, perched on the spine of the Appalachian Mountains where the nearest paved road might be an hour's bone-rattling drive away. A few years before Ethan finally told me everything, Ray and Griffin were sent to a new tract on a remote peak near the Kentucky-West Virginia border. One of those places where logging leases butt up against stretches of national forest and old coal company land that nobody really patrols. It took the company weeks just to bulldoze a narrow road up through the laurel and rock so the lowboys could haul the saws up there. By the time they started cutting, Ray said it felt like they were working on their own island in the sky. Nothing but miles of ridges and hollows dropping off on all sides. 10 days in, they'd found their rhythm, moving methodically along a steep bench when the radios started acting strange. At first, it was just static with hints of voices buried underneath, like somebody leaning on a mic somewhere far away. Then, little by little, the fragments started to sound more distinct male voices, two of them talking low. Ray would be topping a tree and suddenly hear a garbled phrase, laughter, something about the ridge or getting down to water. He and Griffin tried switching channels, the way you do when somebody else is interfering. But no matter what frequency they picked, the chatter seemed to follow. It didn't sound like other crews. There were no call signs, no mention of equipment, no familiar shorthand. Just a kind of aimless conversation that somehow felt wrong, too relaxed given how rugged and empty that mountain was. Griffin joked at first that some hunters had found their frequency, but Ray couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was knew exactly where they were. As they pushed farther up the mountain each day, Ray started to notice other signs that people had been moving through that forest, and not in any normal way. He'd find rusted cans stacked carefully in little towers near old stumps, or see footprints in the fine dust of old skid trails where no trucks had been in years. Once, he parked his machine to take a leak, and noticed a tree, about 50 yards off the cut line with something carved deep into the bark. Two stick figure shapes side by side, each with a little box drawn over the chest, like crude representations of men wearing harnesses or vests. Above them, in uneven letters, someone had carved the words "two cutters." That alone would be creepy enough, somebody marking the woods with a tally of how many workers were up there. But what made Ray's stomach twist was that there were several other stick figures carved below, all crossed out with long, ragged X marks. He didn't tell Griffin about that tree right away. He just walked back to his saw, feeling like the mountain was no longer neutral ground. A day or two later, Griffin called him over the radio to say Head found something off on a side spur and wanted another set of eyes. Ray bumped his machine down the narrow, freshly cleared track until he saw Griffin's tree saw parked at a crooked angle. Cab empty. The man himself standing off in the brush, staring at a patch of green canvas almost swallowed by rhododendron. It was a tent, low and stained, almost camouflaged by leaves and dirt. They walked closer, calling out a couple of times, but no one answered. The tent flap was zippered shut. Griffin, stubborn as always, nudged it open with the toe of his boot and then peeled it back. Inside, there was a single sleeping bag laid out on a foam pad, a lantern, and a duffel bag. When Griffin tugged the bag open, Ray said his first impression was just clutter clothes. A few toiletries, but then specific items jumped out, and his brain refused to slot them into anything normal. Several pairs of children's underwear, all small and patterned, folded with a kind of care that made his skin crawl. Rolls of duct tape and lengths of nylon rope. A notebook filled with crude, obsessive drawings of kids in situations Ray couldn't bring himself to describe without feeling sick. Tucked into a side pocket was a thin stack of photographs. Some of them pictures of children ripped from what looked like old-school newsletters or catalogs. Others obviously taken with a cheap camera, showing kids at parks or near school buses, their faces just out of focus enough to make them harder to identify. The last photo in the stack turned Ray's blood to ice, a grainy shot of his own cutting deck taken from the tree line. Both tree saws visible, one of them clearly his, the company name on the side just legible. It meant whoever lived in that tent had been close enough to their work site to watch them, to take pictures, and then retreat without leaving more than a faint path. The duffel also held what looked like a mason jar full of teeth, too small and too many to make sense at a glance. Ray didn't want to believe they were human. He told himself they were animal teeth from something hunted or scavenged. But even later, sitting safe in his kitchen, he admitted to Ethan, he'd never be sure. Right then he told Griffin they needed to leave, to pack up and go down the mountain. But Griffin, as practical as he was, argued that they were behind schedule, that they didn't know when whoever owned the tent would be back, and that they at least needed to tell their foreman first. In the end, they compromised. They'd move the tent's location a short distance in their minds, but not disturb the contents, limit their radio chatter to work calls, and plan to bring it up with the boss at the end of the week when he drove up to check the site. That night, the two of them stayed in the battered camper the company had hauled up and leveled near the landing, a faded white box parked just off the logging road. They cooked, didn't talk much about what they'd seen, and lay down in their bunks with the radio turned low on the shelf. Around midnight, the radio came crackling to life again, louder than before. This time, the words were clearer, two male voices speaking in that same casual tone, only now the content drifted closer to home, mentions of cutting, of chainsaws, of those boys up on the crown. At one point, Ray swore he heard one voice say something about watching them walk back to the camper when the sun went down. There was also a sound under the words, a kind of tuneless whistling, like someone blowing air through their teeth as they talked. Hearing his own situation described in someone else's private conversation broke something inside him. Up until then, he'd been able to half pretend the tent belonged to some long-gone drifter. But that chatter meant someone was listening in, possibly close. Griffin still tried to shrug it off, saying it could be a scanner picking up multiple frequencies, but even he fell quiet after that. The next morning, when Ray stepped out of the camper to relieve himself, he noticed something hanging from the driver's side mirror of his truck. A little bundle of sticks tied together with a red shoelace, forming a rough diamond shape. Stuffed into the center of the bundle was a small, light-colored object. Up close, he realized it was a tooth, long and slightly curved, with a dark root. It could have been from a deer, he told himself over and over, but that didn't change the fact that someone had walked up to their vehicle in the night and taken the time to make and hang that thing there, a handmade calling card. He took it down and threw it into the brush without telling Griffin what he'd seen, not because he wanted to keep secrets, but because he could feel his own composure fraying and didn't know what might happen if Griffin started to unravel too. Later that day, Ray finally snapped and spoke into the radio, asking in a hard, controlled voice, who was on their frequency and what they wanted, trying to sound more annoyed than scared. The channel went dead so fast it was like someone had cut a wire. For the rest of the afternoon, there was nothing but normal work chatter between him and Griffin. Ray hoped that meant whoever had been listening decided to move on. Griffin thought Ray had just given away the fact that they were rattled. They argued about it in low voices over dinner, their unease simmering into frustration, and went to bed without really resolving anything. Sometime after midnight, Griffin shook Ray awake with a hand on his shoulder. His whisper was so low Ray almost didn't catch it, but the panic in it came through clearly. There was someone outside. At first, Ray heard nothing but the thudding of his own heart. But then, as he lay there holding his breath, he picked up the faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside the camper. Slow and deliberate, circling, the door handle jiggled once, twice, as if someone were testing whether it was locked. The camper sat high on its wheels, with no steps pulled out, which meant whoever was at the door had to be reaching up, balanced on the tires or the frame. After a pause, there came a new sound, a dragging scrape like metal or bone being pulled along the exterior of the door, down and then up again. Long, lazy strokes that went on far too long to be a nervous tick. Ray realized, with a kind of cold clarity he would later describe to Ethan, that the sound matched the rough whistling head heard under the radio chatter. The same uneven rhythm, as if the person outside hummed through their teeth while they worked the blade against the metal. Scratch, scratch. A brief whistle. Scratch. The noise continued for several minutes, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Ray finally mouthed to Griffin that he was going to check. He slid out of the bunk, feeling for his handgun on the shelf, only to realize the magazine he always kept next to it was missing. He had an empty firearm and no idea where the ammunition had gone. Later, when he thought about that detail, it chilled him more than almost anything else. It meant someone had been inside their living space at some point, close enough to their bunks to reach for a gun and quietly separate it from its ammo. The idea that this wasn't just random, but a pattern, a slow, deliberate disarming, made him feel like an animal that had been tagged and tracked for days before the trap was sprung. Before he could decide what to do next, the door burst inward with a slam that made the whole camper shudder. A figure lunged into the frame and something sharp flashed in the dark. Ray felt a line of fire tear across his face from brow to cheek, hot and sudden, then a heavier impact as he fell backward out of the camper and onto the cold dirt below. The world narrowed to pain and chaos. Through the blur of blood and shock, he was aware of a heavy weight crashing down on top of him, knees pinning his arms, the cold edge of a knife pressed against his throat. Another pair of boots pounded around to his side, and someone started kicking him in the head and ribs in short, vicious bursts. He could hear Griffin scrambling in the camper behind him, hear one of the attackers cursing under his breath. But the words themselves didn't stick. What did stick was the smell, unwashed sweat, old smoke, something sour, and the awareness that these men were not surprised, not panicked, just executing something they'd planned. In the midst of that beating, a weirdly precise detail seared itself into his memory. As he turned his head slightly, trying to get air, he could see under the truck, parked next to the camper, and there, just beyond the pool of light cast by their one working flood lamp, he saw a third pair of boots. They were smaller than the others, scuffed, standing perfectly still, toes pointed toward the scene, like someone was just watching. The boots didn't move, didn't rush in to help or flee. They just stayed rooted, witnessing. When the struggle escalated, Griffin finally launching himself out of the camper, tackling the man with the knife off Ray, wrestling him into the dirt. That third pair of boots stepped backward, one slow step, then another, and disappeared into the dark. Ray would later swear he hadn't imagined that part, and the fact that there might have been another, unseen person there, a quiet observer, haunts him even more than the two who actually laid hands on him. Griffin's tackle broke the rhythm of the attack. The man with the knife lost his grip on Ray's throat and turned his fury on Griffin instead. The second attacker hesitated for a heartbeat, then bolted into the black line of trees, and the one wrestling with Griffin tore free a moment later and sprinted after him. Within seconds, both were gone. swallowed by the forest, leaving Ray bleeding on the ground and Griffin shaking, his chest heaving. They didn't wait to see if anyone was coming back. Griffin helped Ray into the truck, his face a mask of blood and shock, and they drove down that rough mountain road in the dark, headlights cutting a tunnel through the trees, every curve feeling like it might reveal someone standing in the beams. It took almost 2 hours to reach a hospital, where doctors stitched Ray's face and told him that the cut across his eye had done permanent damage. He would never see clearly out of that side again. They reported everything to the county deputies, who listened with a mixture of professional concern and weary resignation. Up there, they said, the woods were full of people who didn't want to be found. Yes, they'd go up and look around. No, they couldn't promise much. Ray and Griffin did not go back to that job site. The company sent other crews to finish the cut after law enforcement gave a cautious all clear. 2 weeks later, as the last loads were being dragged out and the operation wound down, one of the skidder operators didn't show up for lunch. They found him hours later in a drainage ditch off one of the lower spurs, his hands bound, his mouth gagged, his body showing signs of the kind of assault that makes your stomach clench just hearing about it. He was dead. There were no cameras up there, no witnesses except the trees. Investigators came and went. Tracks were photographed, fibers collected, interviews conducted. No one was ever arrested. Officially, it became another unsolved crime in a region that has more than its share of them. Unofficially, among the men who worked those ridges, it turned into something else. A story about the fact that there are predators in the hills who don't look like monsters. Just other men who know the terrain better than you do and understand exactly how long it takes for a call for help to reach a radio tower. To this day, Ray lives with a cloudy right eye and a permanent scar that pulls the skin of his face into a slight, involuntary squint on that side. He still startles when radios crackle unexpectedly, still flinches at certain noises in the night. Ethan says his dad hasn't had a full, peaceful night's sleep since that job. Even when he dozes in his chair, his fingers twitch like he's reaching for a gun that isn't there. I haven't talked to either of them in years. Life, doing what it does and scattering people in different directions. But whenever I see logging trucks grinding up a mountain road or hear about a new operation starting on some remote tract, I think about Ray and Griffin on that ridge, the tent half hidden in the brush, the carved tree quietly counting 2 cutters, the homemade bundle hanging from the mirror, the extra pair of boots watching from the dark. It's easy, from a distance, to romanticize the deep woods, to picture nothing but streams and deer and autumn leaves. Harder, but more honest, to remember that the same isolation that makes those places beautiful also makes them perfect for people who don't want to be seen. If you've ever worked in those kinds of remote Appalachian jobs, or lived near a ridge where strange things happened and never made the news, or if this reminds you of something you or your family went through, I'd honestly like to hear it. Share your story in the comments, or even just say what you think might have been going on up there, because sometimes it helps to know you're not the only one who looks at those mountains and feels a chill that has nothing to do with the weather.